Well, I am flattered and super excited to have Jason Miller, CEO of GETTR, among other things. I know you've got like a pretty good background, and I love what you're doing. And so I wanted to say, first of all, congratulations, because as I read this, Jason, you've hit 1 million subscribers or users faster than Facebook or Twitter on GETTR, which is remarkable.
Well, and in addition to that, we've hit 2 million, 3 million, 4 million, now 5 million faster than anybody else in history. And the reason why this is important is because it shows that there is that desire out there for free speech. Mm-hmm. People are clamoring for something different than Twitter and Facebook and Instagram and kind of the social media big tech platform, so to speak. And so it goes to what we believed all along, that people are ready to start cutting the cord from big tech.
Yeah, you know, it's interesting because it's really frustrating watching how this whole thing played out with the election, because you and I think will agree that whether or not laws were broken in the 2020 election to kind of oust Trump, we can totally agree that big tech, you know, social media, they tipped the scales and they interfered, right? I think that's a fair statement. And so what I find fascinating about that is that if you wanted Trump gone, you had no problem with it, right? Because your guy won. But what's interesting to me, and where this has kind of taken a turn, is related to COVID. Because I think there's a lot of people initially that, you know, were kind of, all right, COVID's scary, I want to do the right thing. But then as time went on and we started getting more and more sort of draconian measures that didn't line up with what our real world experience was, it started, you know, people started to say, wait a minute, like they're not sure they're getting the right information. And that's kind of scary when these big companies have that kind of control. So I'm curious, like from your perspective, I'm sure you agree with that, but what are you doing differently so that doesn't happen on GETTR?
Well, exactly. And the whole reason we launched GETTR in 2021 is because while I was working for President Trump in 2020, and even before that with co-hosting Steve Bannon's War Room podcast, what we realized is that we were in the worst year, maybe even 2 years, of political censorship in American history. We saw early in 2020 when they started to suppress any voices that dared to say something as radical and extreme, such as the virus came from a lab in Wuhan, which, spoiler alert, it did. I don't know if it was man-made or if it was traipsed out by a lazy worker, but it came from a lab in Wuhan. I mean, there's a reason why the Chinese shut down travel from Wuhan to other parts of the country for Chinese New Year in 2020. They knew what was going on. They just didn't want to tell the rest of the world. But we saw voices being silenced at that time. We saw voices being silenced who dared to criticize his Lord and Savior, Dr. Anthony Fauci. And then, of course, as we moved into the fall of 2020, then, of course, we're seeing all this news right now about Hunter Biden and the laptop. The big expose in the Washington Post today about the truth, about how there actually were some shady Hunter in China business dealings that we found out from the laptop, which I'm like, Washington Post, if only we had known that in 2020, right. If only you guys had researched that, then we could have been saved. But of course, then we saw in early 2021, President Trump being completely deplatformed, even though you have Putin, the Taliban, the Ayatollah, Hamas, all on Twitter. You can't have President Trump or Babylon Bee or Charlie Kirk or Tucker Carlson. Those are the bad guys. So what we've seen here is essentially two classes. If you agree with the big tech, social media oligarchs, you can have free speech. If you don't agree with them, then you don't. You get kicked off, you get deplatformed, you get shadow banned. And it's not even about just this keeping people safe, or we're trying to protect people from self-harm or misinformation, any of these types of tropes. But you take a look at what Google and YouTube are now doing with regard to climate change, where if you mention climate change at all, you get a little warning that pops up. Now, look, I'm not a big, massive climate change zealot. I'm not someone who gets in there and really fights on that fights. I mean, I think the world's changing. I think some of it's probably man, some of it's probably nature. I'm not a scientist. I don't know the balance to each of them. But I do know that when Google and YouTube start talking about climate change the same way they might be talking about, as they would describe it, an insurrection at the Capitol, we have problems.
Well, I mean, it's pretty arrogant of humans to think that we can make that much of a difference in a planet that's 30 million years old, right? To me, it's always about follow the money. There's a reason why climate change is being promoted. And I don't know what all the math behind it is, but I know enough to know that if you look into it far enough and follow the money, there's a reason, right? So I look at Section 230 and the whole publisher platform component. And obviously, when you're a platform, you're not really supposed to, I guess, take a stance, but you're immune from the liability as it relates to that. So do you think we're going to get any movement on that at all? And if so, how is that going to affect you and GETTR and your business?
So I don't think we're going to have any movement on it this year in 2022. I do think when Republicans take over after the midterms, maybe into 2023, 2024, we will. Now, I'll tell you about my position on Section 230. I think it needs to be reformed to make sure that if you're going to get that liability shield, if you're going to get that protection, then you can't exercise in political discrimination. You have to have the same moderation policies applied to everyone, regardless of political ideology. The problem right now is that the big tech platforms are going through, again, whether it's Twitter, Facebook, they're saying one set of standards applies to one user, a different set of standards applies to a different user. Mm-hmm. And quite frankly, I think that's wrong. If you're going to hide behind that immunity shield, so to speak, then you need to treat people the exact same, regardless of their ideology. But that's not what we're seeing right now. And so that's part of the reason we launched GETTR. We knew there had to be something different. There had to be a free speech, safe space, so to speak. What I couldn't have imagined is just how much more authoritarian governments would become under COVID. And again, it's not just the United States, which has taken what might seem like small steps, although now we're at the place where we have the White House literally partnering with social media companies to pick winners and losers, to say we need to get this person off of a platform or that person can stay on a platform. That's nuts. If you can imagine Donald Trump sitting there saying, hey, we got to kick fake news Jim Acosta off of Twitter. What do you guys think? And they went and did it. People would lose their marbles. They would say, whoa, this is, since when did we become some authoritarian regime? The way you see Justin Trudeau in Canada go and start to seize bank accounts because truckers dared to raise their voice and say we shouldn't have these forced mandates and these policies. You see some of the rules that are going on in the EU, and you realize that unless we have a platform like GETTR that protects free speech, this is a real slippery slope. This is a real dangerous, and it's somewhere George Orwell is rolling over in his grave.
Well, and what's crazy is it's blatantly obvious at this point, right? In the beginning, there were some word salads that could be created to kind of dodge what was happening, and it's a joke when these guys get called in front of Congress. It's just a bunch of grandstanding, and nothing ever happens. They lie through their teeth about whether there's censorship or not, and they use just the right words so that they don't have any real accountability. And probably it's because they control the politicians, right? This is how that works, and it's super frustrating. But I'll tell you, Jason, it's concerning because these are not small little things, right? So if you look at, for example, the coordination really between GoFundMe in Canada and what Justin Trudeau did with the freezing of the bank accounts, that's now a private-public partnership to create policy that you can't really create entirely on your own as a government. That's some scary stuff. And that's just like the tip of the iceberg, right? So have you done much looking into the concept of central bank digital currencies at all?
Yes. And one of the things where I get particularly concerned is, these are supposedly progressive left of center governments. Right. They're now becoming authoritarian and seizing everything. I think that's part of the reason is we look ahead to GETTR Pay, the two-coin crypto ecosystem payment platform that we want to launch this summer. One of the main appeals is going to be this is something where, again, the Justin Trudeaus from the world can't come through and seize it or make yourself uncancelable when it comes to banking, because I'm really concerned from just the basic civil libertarian perspective that if you can have a Michael Lindell in the middle of a Steve Bannon War Room appearance be kicked off or kicked out of the bank that he's been with for decades in Minnesota, That's scary stuff. That's literally, that's not just saying, hey, one group has free speech, another doesn't. But then it takes that next step. One group has financial independence or financial wherewithal, another one doesn't, purely because of ideology.
Yeah, I mean, again, what I find ironic about this whole thing, right, is everything that they accuse Donald Trump of doing, these people are actually doing, right? So I listened to, and one of the things that's really concerning to me is I listened to the Joe Rogan podcast with Majid Avazar. Do you know, have you listened to that?
Yeah, and in fact, Majid, we actually have a partnership that we did with GETTR. We were actually the very first ones to call him when he was in a politically discriminatory way sacked from LBC. Mm-hmm. We were the very first ones who called and said, Majid, let's team up. We want you on GETTR doing weekly live streams. So he's here on GETTR. He's active, and I heard the entire episode, and he's a pretty impressive guy. For anyone who doesn't know, he's kind of I don't throw this around loosely, but he's kind of a UK version of Joe Rogan, so to speak, has his own style, his own background, but comes from a non-right of center traditional underpinning, but has been awoken as he's seen developments in the last few years.
What I found fascinating, and one of the things he said in that podcast, and I completely agree with, is the fact that in the US and in the West, I guess you could say, we've weaponized the English language, and we use things like racism and extremism, I think are the words. And what I thought was really fascinating is when he said, look, racism is when you walk down the street and people try to cut you with a machete or stab you with a knife or a screwdriver because of the way you look, your skin color, your nationality, et cetera, religion. And in the United States, when we think of racism, it's a completely different thing. But what was really fascinating to me was when he started talking about the military level psychological operators that were working with Twitter, right? He called it the 77th Brigade, which is in London, and that's a military branch that does psyops. And he proved definitively that there are people that do that. And it was related to COVID, but I'm certain that it's happening here in the United States. And that's scary stuff when you get that level of manipulation or propaganda, using it on your own people. This is not wartime where they're using it on the enemy. They're using it on their own people to force compliance. That's some scary stuff, Jason.
No, you're exactly right. And that's where we see, it seems like it's starting small, but then it gets big. And one other point that I'd make is that once President Trump was deplatformed, it really became the suns out, guns out phase of censorship in America. In fact, I liken it to, I like to take the family bowling, although not too often because I usually don't win. But for our 5-year-old, we put up the bumpers on the side. So kind of, so no matter what she does, unless she turns around and throws it at us, the ball's going to go somewhere in the right direction toward the pins. Effectively, what we did is we dropped those guardrails with regard to I guess you'd say, the boundaries of what big tech platforms could go and do. So they kicked off a sitting president of the United States. That still absolutely blows my mind. I was one of those people. Look, I'll be the first one to tell you. I always say, there's no way they're ever going to go and deplatform a sitting president. They wouldn't do that. You guys are just being, chicken little. The sky is falling. Now I tell people my single biggest regret about the 2020 campaign is that we didn't spend 2017, 18, and 19 building a new social media platform so that whether it be President Trump or anyone else would be impervious to this cancel culture that we ended up seeing in 2020 and 2021 and even until now.
Oh, it's hit, it's hit a fevered peak at this point. It's a little bit like, and this is the part that is really, really frustrating when you have conversations with people that just don't take the time. It's the TLDR Society, right? Too long, didn't read. And so they're just not really into like all of the details. And it's a little bit like the story of how you can boil a frog, right? Well, if you put the frog in a lukewarm pot of water, it doesn't go anywhere. Next thing you know, it's 212 degrees and the frog is dead. And it happens over a few minutes. It doesn't happen right away. And what's happening in the United States and in Europe and really other parts of the world, but in the United States in particular, we're losing our freedoms one little step at a time. And in the process, people say just what you thought initially. That's, oh, that'll never happen. You're a conspiracy theorist. Get your tinfoil hat off, right? And yet, for me, it's like, can you not see the progression of where things are going, right? And to me, Jason, what they did, okay, so the reputational risk that, Mike Lindell posed to Minnesota Bank and Trust, that was bullshit. All right. You and I both know that. Okay. And to take it and so to take this a step further, can you imagine putting that kind of power or control in the hands of someone like Elizabeth Warren, okay, or Gretchen Whitmer in my state in Michigan, and giving them power over a federal, a federally issued currency where they have the wallet, so they know everything about you, they know every single transaction you make, and they can program it so that they can disincentivize you to spend money. They could literally kick you out of the entire financial system. They could theoretically, on the DL, prevent you from making political contributions. And for those people who say that'll never happen, you look at the last 24 months and you tell me what's not possible going forward.
No, you're exactly right. And I witnessed some of that firsthand when I went to Brazil this past fall. And as I was leaving the country, I was detained at the airport for several hours, and they wanted to ask me questions about these 2 secret investigations they were undertaking. And I asked them, well, what are these secret investigations? And they go, we can't tell you. They're secret. I'm like, okay. Although I always tell people that, look, I was detained 3 hours and we got 100,000 new followers. If I'd known that, I would have stayed for 6 hours. It was great for the platform. But here's what we start seeing in other countries. We're seeing, especially in Brazil with their Supreme Court, but in other places where they're going in and saying, we are going to cancel people. I mean, they were literally going to cancel Telegram from the entire country of Brazil unless they got rid of one specific user. There were some other parts to it where they were saying they weren't replying to the Supreme Court. They weren't doing enough to crack down on some of these anti-democratic things. But really, it was mainly about one user that they wanted eliminated from the Telegram platform. What we see, though, is, again, these governments and then big tech completely willing accomplices along with this, in coordination with the media, with universities, academia, as well as we talk about pop culture. I mean, some of the news we've seen from Disney, for example, over the last couple of days is just mind-boggling. And this is so whacked out. If you haven't seen this, the head of Disney content said that she literally wanted to have a goal of having 50% of all kids going forward, as far as in Disney movies, being either racial minorities, which, hey, we need to have a good representation. Look at Encanto, look at Moana, look at a number of movies they've shown different cultures. Great, I'm all about that. That's awesome. Kids love it. Show the world. That's great. But not just racial minorities, but also the LGBTQIA. No plus at the end, just the LGBTQIA, but they left off the plus, which I thought was kind of strange. 50% of all characters. Now, again, I'm not a biologist, so I don't know how these things necessarily work, but why are we talking about kids and sex and trans issues or whatever this pansexual thing is? That is not something, when kids sit down and veg out and watch a movie, if they're watching the iPad or you're taking a drive, and like all good parents, we look for those 15 or 20 minutes to get them distracted on something while you're trying to get work done, like any true parent does in America nowadays. If you're talking about pansexuality with a child, you're losing. I'm not one to go and point fingers at someone on their parenting, but I'm just going to say, if you're encouraging pansexuality with a child, that's going to a weird level of conformity that I don't think, quite frankly, is something that's along with our traditional norms.
No, I mean, it's gotten, I mean, this whole conversation, I had a conversation with my daughter last night, who is just graduated from high school this past Friday. And she's, a huge proponent of, treating everybody nicely. If you want to transition from a boy to a girl, all that stuff. And we got into a huge intellectual debate about, the bathrooms and all this stuff. And, I told her at the end, because it was a couple hours long, we had this conversation about it. And I said, the biggest issue right now is that you've got one group that I understand they feel a little disenfranchised. And so now what's happening is they're the aggressor, they're making the demands. And we on the other side, who maybe don't entirely understand the argument, just don't want to be told that we're bad if we don't agree with them and that we're all these different labels. And effectively, if we could drop the really aggressive language and the name calling and the categorizing, right? And just be a little bit more understanding, we'd all meet in the middle, and then there wouldn't be this big fight. Which, this is an important question for you, because I really, this is the part I don't get, but being the CEO of a massive and hugely growing social media company, what I don't understand is what's the end game for the Facebooks and the Twitters and the Googles, right? Why are they so hell-bent on what's the end game, right? Why do they want to get rid of Trump so badly? Why do they want to destroy the American family and the family values so badly? It just seems like there's a reason for it. I don't believe they're all ideologues. I think that you've got ideologues at the top, and then you've got useful idiots sort of at the bottom that are just out there that have been programmed and believe everything they're told. But what's their end game, Jason? I don't get it.
Yeah, it's very simple. It's world forming. And so if you go back a decade, 15 years, I think even the robot Zuckerberg, Jack Dorsey, social media oligarchs of that nature, I think they probably did have a goal of here's how we can connect people. Here's how to do something fun and new and cool. Now, as they've amassed this power, this great wealth, this great ability to move public opinion or to house public opinion, this new digital town square, they're not content with that. Now they want to go and shape their world in the image that they want it to be. And for some of them, I think they're more, as you pointed out, more ideologically motivated. They're real deep down in their core, they really believe it. I think you're exactly right. I think a lot of people just don't want to get canceled. They don't want to go and get voted out. And even now in California, where decline to state is now has more people in that category than Republicans. So Republicans actually the number 3 party in California. A lot of those people are just Republicans who just don't want to get the cancellation, who don't want to get the public attacks from people being like, oh, you're Republican, we can't have you part of our team. But even one of the things is I've talked to people in Silicon Valley, they say, even if you're a registered independent, the left looks at you and like, you're probably a Republican, aren't you? You're just saying that you're independent because you don't want to identify as a Republican. And keep in mind that for the people at the top, the true hardcore left ideologues, the people who definitely want to go and push their indoctrination on other people, the language that you used about protecting our families or protecting our cultures or things of that nature, they use the exact same language, but they use it a way of forcing their beliefs onto other people. I come from a perspective of let people do their own thing, trust in people, let them pursue their religion, let them be proud of their own countries, that we should be encouraging people to embrace their beliefs, but never go and try to force your beliefs or impose your value set on other people. That's something that I think has never really been the case for America. I think it's always been kind of this great melting pot, but now it's almost the reverse, where they're not satisfied with people having equal rights across the board, which of course want all people to be treated equal. They now want special rights for some, or they now want plus rights for others. And I think that really has a lot of people worrying, saying, wait a minute, identity politics isn't saving America. Identity politics is ruining America. And right now, as we speak, there are people in Kyiv, people in Mariupol getting blown to hell. Do you think any of those people give a rat's ass about pronouns at this moment? That's how the real world works. Like, wait, you want to identify as what? Well, right now, unless you start running, you're going to identify as dead. So put that in your pipe and smoke it.
Yeah, you're talking about real world issues, right? So my daughter, going back to that conversation, I told her, look, you can ask me, and I'm happy to do it, right? So if I can say he, she, they, however it is that the person wants to be referred to, I'm happy to say it, but you can't make me think it, right? So I'm happy to do it because I want to make that person feel comfortable and, okay to engage with me. And we're all humans in the end, right? So we all have to inhabit this planet. But what I don't want is to be forced into seeing the world the way that you want me to see it. And what's happening now, and going back to treating everybody equally, it's not just that they want necessarily special treatment for certain groups, but they want to punish other people for not complying, right? And when you go, in terms of compliance, if you go back and now you look at what's happening with, with COVID, for example, it was forced compliance. And in the beginning, we all were like, okay, this is scary stuff. Nobody wants to die. I don't want my family at risk. I'm going to do whatever these people tell me to do because we don't know what we're dealing with. And this is the scariest thing we've ever seen, right? And all of a sudden, after a while, and we started to get more data, it became less obvious that this was as threatening as what we were told, right? And then it was really from that point on that the entire debate got shut down, right? Then it was like, it's groupthink, it's only one way. And any intellectual, you couldn't ask questions, you couldn't bring data that you just wanted some extra clarification on, that was it. And what I see now, Jason, and this is kind of scary, it's the same thing is happening with Ukraine and Russia. It is very pro-Ukraine. They're making Zelensky this hero. And look, in the United States, as you know, you know this better than anybody outside of probably Bannon and Trump, right? Is that we as a country on the left purposefully have made Putin our enemy. We have used him as the boogeyman. And I'm not saying he's a good guy. I'm not saying he's a bad guy. I don't know. Okay. But what I know is this, is that they have done their level best to make him our enemy for the last 6 years, right? He's been the boogeyman, he's been responsible for everything. And what I find interesting is the entire media complex has jumped in with both feet on that story. And I think there's more to it than what meets the eye.
Yeah, I think you're spot on. Just to be clear, I am not a fan of Putin. I do not like Putin. I think this invasion of a sovereign country is clearly illegal. Two things can be true at the same time here. Mm-hmm. I think, like most Americans, I think that Russia doesn't have to be an ally, but they don't have to be an enemy either. And as a kid of the Cold War, I mean, I grew up in the 80s and have watched Red Dawn about 100 times, yelling Wolverines. The fact that we're now at a point where we don't have this stalemate, that we're at the throes of going after each other's throats, I think is a good thing. And I think President Trump smartly played that relationship after we saw Putin go and take Crimea in 2014, when you had the Obama-Biden White House. Now you see what he's doing in Ukraine while Biden is in the White House, but he has Biden's number all the way through. I think Biden has completely misplayed this. In fact, I said when I was on with Steve Bannon on Saturday that I point to every death that has happened in Ukraine, and I'm putting that on Joe Biden. I'm saying if Joe Biden hasn't continually ratcheted up and escalated this conflict with Putin, if Biden had been using his time and effort to say, hey guys, let's dial it back on NATO expansion, let's dial it back a little bit on EU expansion, let's make sure that we're not going and pushing things that cause a conflict or keep a conflict going. So when you see Putin say, hey, this is a red line for me, I do not want Ukraine to be a member of NATO, otherwise we're going to have problems, the answer is not Joe Biden to then go and send another 200 million in arms to Ukraine, because at that point we've already lost the deterrence. With Trump, we had deterrence. With Biden, we don't have any deterrence because it's very clear. You can read his cards very easily. Every step in this process, whether it be the trip the last couple of days where Biden had to walk back saying that U.S. soldiers are going to be standing there in front of Russian tanks, implying that we're in Ukraine, he had to walk that back. Then saying that Putin couldn't remain in power, even getting the likes of Macron saying, whoa, you can't push a regime change. That's not going to help. Biden put us that much closer to midnight on the doomsday clock, all because it's a combination of him being an idiot, the globalist ideology, and you know what, Joe, use your bully pulpit, use your soapbox to get these two sides together and come out with something that's going to save lives, as opposed to something that's going to cause more loss of innocent life.
I couldn't agree more. To be honest with you, Jason, the whole Trump impeachment started with a phone call to Zelensky, right? And before that, which was, obviously it's Ukrainian tied now. And if you go back before that and the firing of the Ukrainian prosecutor, all this stuff, I don't think Biden gives two shits about what happens in Ukraine. I really don't. I don't think he cares about the people. I think it's a political thing for him. And it's pretty sad because people are dying and he's sitting there kind of goading Putin in different ways. And it's a very, very frustrating thing to sit and watch. And what I guess, I'm curious, two things, because I know you got to go. So I've got you, and I need a little insight here. Okay, the first question is this: is that do you think that Trump has learned anything from the last 4-year cycle in terms of dialing down a little bit of the picking, not so much the picking fights with everyone, but not letting the little things go and toning down, or maybe improving his likability so that it's less of an issue going forward? And I don't want to change who he is, right? Because he's a fighter. I get that. We need a fighter. It's kind of like Jack Nicholson in A Few Good Men. You want me on that wall, right? But at the same time, I think that he lost some people in his own party because of what we'll call his adversarial sort of behavior, right? So is there anything learned there? And if he runs in 2024, will we see a slightly different Trump?
Short answer is I don't think that President Trump is going to change his style. I think where he's going to be more successful is when that's channeled and that's focused more toward, I think, the CCP in China, which is where the real flashpoint is going to be when they make their move on Taiwan. That might be a little bit delayed or slowed down, as I do think that Putin has mismanaged much of his Ukraine invasion, but the existential threat, not just to the United States, but to Western civilization as a whole, is from the CCP. If President Trump is channeling his efforts toward there, then I think that he's going to be much more successful. And look, I've told him a number of times before, we can push for the voting law changes and things of that nature, but going into 2024, if you decide to run, you're going to need to talk about what you're going to do for people, because at a certain point, the media is going to turn it back around and try to make it as though all you want to do is relitigate 2020. What you want to do is essentially reverse or, paraphrase Ronald Reagan. Are you better off now today than you were 4 years ago? Or were you better off in the 4 years when I was in charge? And the answer is people are worse off than they were when President Trump was in office. So he has a great story to tell. But I think if it's channeled, if it's forward looking, I think he's going to be much more successful than if he's looking at 2020. Some of those issues are important to discuss. Absolutely, especially we talk about how some of the unconstitutional rule changes, things of that nature. But that needs to be a small component of the overall messaging.
I very much appreciate that. And I guess, looking back, these are first world problems, right? People were offended by his tweets, and now they've got $6 a gallon gasoline, and they've got supply chain issues, and they've got a lack of freedom and all this other stuff. So related to Trump, I mean, obviously, I love what DeSantis is doing in Florida. Is there any chance those two will end up on the same ticket? I mean, do you think that's a possibility?
I don't think so, for the simple fact that DeSantis wants to be president, and he's in a pretty good position to do it if President Trump, for some reason, doesn't run, or if President Trump does run and win, then he only has the 4 years. So whether or not he wins or loses, then I think you're looking at more of a DeSantis 2028 type run. But I don't see a scenario where they'd be on the same ticket. But you know what? Crazier things have happened.
The last thing is just like a little bit of a commentary, but what just really, it's disturbing, Jason, on like an incredibly visceral level, is that if you look at what happened with Joe Biden, the people that have propped him up knew he was cognitively impaired, knew that he was not only cognitively impaired, but likely politically compromised, and they didn't give a shit. They wanted Trump gone so badly that they were willing to set our entire country back to the extent that they have to save the system from the existential threat that is populism, right?
And just in the last 2 weeks, you have the failing New York Times and the Amazon Washington Post coming out and acknowledging that the Hunter laptop was real, and acknowledging that the Biden family business dealings were real. And so they're already starting to play that card, i.e., hey, Joe, you've had a bad run. We see some of these other issues. You don't need to run again. So they literally used him as their useful idiot to go and say, hey, look at nice old sweet Uncle Joe, genteel Joe. We're going to get rid of the mean tweets. We're going to put in Joe. The world's going to be saved. And now, of course, as we see the world's going to hell, largely all on Biden's self-created crises, they're setting it up so then they push him aside and say, who's going to be next? I think 2024, I think we do see President Trump run, but I think it'll be Trump not against Biden, but I think maybe someone like a California Governor Gavin Newsom or Gretchen Whitmer from Michigan. Although I think Newsom would probably run circles around Whitmer, but I think she's ambitious. Maybe it's a Newsom Whitmer ticket against Trump and whoever he goes with.
Well, I hope so, because then she'll leave Michigan. So that would be great. So, all right, listen, you have been awesome, very generous with your time. I am elated about your success. I'm going to do everything I can to help promote GETTR and to get more people, because we need their fingers off the scales. We need freedom, independence, intellectual dialogue, debate, ideas, all that stuff. So congratulations and thank you so much for joining us on the show today.
Thanks again for having me.